Hear the Gospel of our Lord Jesus Christ according to Mark. Jesus got up and went away from there to the region of Tyre. And when he had entered a house, he wanted no one to know of it, yet he could not escape notice. But after hearing of him, a woman, whose little daughter had an unclean spirit, immediately came and fell at his feet. Now the woman was a Gentile of the syrophoenician race, and she kept asking him to cast the demon out of her daughter. And he was saying to her, "Let the children be satisfied first, for it's not good to take the children's bread and throw it to the dogs." But she answered and said to him, "Yes, Lord, but even the dogs under the table feed on the children's crumbs." And he said to her, "Because of this answer, go. The demon has gone out of your daughter." And going back to her home, she found the child lying on the bed, the demon having left. Mark chapter 1. A man with leprosy comes to Jesus and he heals him. A man with evil spirits comes and he heals him too. Mark chapter 2, a paralytic is brought to Jesus and Jesus heals him. Chapter 3, in front of the whole temple, the man with the shriveled hand holds it out and Jesus heals him. Can you see the pattern we're building up here? Chapter 5, the woman with hemorrhaging touches Jesus' garment and her bleeding is healed. He heals many people, casting out demons from them, and he even heals a dead girl, bringing her back to life. Chapter 7, the reading we heard today. A syrophoenician woman comes to Jesus, and she asks him to heal her daughter, and he says no. And he doesn't just say no either, he insults her. He uses some fairly harsh words. He calls her a dog. It's quite a sickening sentence, really. He says to her, "Let the children," that is the Jews, "be satisfied first, for it's not good to take the children's bread and throw it to the dogs, to the Gentiles." In fact, it sounds like he's kicking her while she's down. She comes to this man reputed for his healing powers with the weight of her daughter's illness on her mind. And the best he has for her are nasty and mean words. And it's not just to our ears either that this sounds uncomfortable. To almost all of the classical scholars, this has been a problem, and they seek many ways to mitigate this problem, to work around it, to try and find a solution. Perhaps the most common way is to say that this was all a sort of a witty repartee. Or maybe a more nuanced version of that is that Mark was writing for his community. They, of course, knew how the story was going to end. They'd heard the oral tradition. They'd maybe heard his gospel read before. And they knew that eventually Jesus was going to heal her. So it's sort of with a stage wink that he comes. Enters from the left, gives a stage wink to the audience, and then goes about this process of building up her faith, of testing that she really does believe that he has the power, that he's capable of doing this. But I don't really buy that. I think the main reason we'd want to suggest that was the case is because then our image of Jesus most fits with what we think it ought to fit with. Actually, the reason that we suggest that reading is because we can't handle a Jesus who would say to a needy woman, "It's not good to take the children's bread and throw it to you dogs." But I'm going to suggest to you that today you do exactly that you really do accept this venomous sentence, as harsh as it sounds to our ears, as the words spoken by Christ. And the reason that I think we ought to do that is because we know that throughout the rest of the Gospel, Jesus doesn't pull his punches, that he has plenty of scathing things to say. Just earlier in this chapter, Jesus is speaking to the Pharisees, in verse 6, and he says to them, Isaiah prophesied rightly about you hypocrites, as it is written, this people honours me with their lips, but their hearts are far from me. In vain do they worship me, teaching human precepts as doctrines. And these are the leaders of the community. They're the leaders of Jesus' community, his teachers, the respected people. They're the holy men, the purest of the pure. And he goes on and says to them, you abandon the commandment of God and you hold to human tradition. I mean, he's not mincing his words here. He's not being gentle with them. And yet, as I was reading over this chapter, I skimmed over that quickly and just sort of ticked that one away, and that was fine. And I was struck when I reached the syrophoenician woman and the words he has to say to her. And so my question really is, why do we find that part of the story, his words to the syrophoenician woman, so difficult to swallow, when we find the words that he says to the Pharisees so normal? I think part of the solution is because of the characters that are involved in these stories, or more accurately perhaps because of the caricatures. When we look at the syrophoenician woman, we see a woman with a sick child with a heavy heart, and she comes to Jesus and she lies at his feet and she looks up to him begging. And in my mind, that means that she represents the lowest of the low. She's exactly the sort of person that Jesus in his moral teaching tells us that we're to look after. She is the poor, the disenfranchised. She's the oppressed, the person who needs healing. Maybe most tellingly as well, she's not like the Pharisees. Instead, she's like me, a Gentile. I think we're so used to dividing the world into goodies and baddies, and not just us either. When we're reading the text, we're used to it, because Mark uses it as a rhetorical device. The words Pharisees and scribes come to indicate not even specific people, but more just the opponents of Jesus. We know very well what's coming when the scribes and the Pharisees turn up at the start of the paragraph. And I understand that that's an important way for us to process the world, but I think it also can blind us. Having those sort of prejudices can lead to us to not understand the nuance of situations. I was particularly struck, this point was brought home to me recently. I'm taking a course with John on prison ministry. One of the books we read is by a chap called Ted Conover. He's a journalist who was denied entry to San Quentin, and he applies to be a prison guard and spent a year undercover working as a prison guard. And this he writes towards the end of his time, when he comes home and he's playing with his 5-year-old son. He says, one of the accessories we inherited from a neighbour was a little jail. It came with a policeman, badge, cap with visor, uniform, and a bad guy, 5 o'clock shadow, eye mask, focus cap. My son asked me about it. Who goes in jail? That burglar, I said, pointing him out. And what does the policeman do? Well, he puts him in jail. My son looked puzzled. Then he's the bad guy. What do you mean? He's the bad guy because he puts the other one in jail. No, I began, trying to explain. The burglar has to go in jail because he did something bad first. The policeman puts him there to keep us safe. Then the burglar's bad and the policeman's bad. No, I said, only the burglar's bad. But my son didn't quite get it. And by that time, he wasn't the only one. And I think we don't quite get this story either. What I think we don't get is that this woman is a Tyrian. We hear at the start of the story, Jesus got up and went away from there to the region of Tyre. And that immediately would have meant something to Mark's hearers. The Tyrians were a people in line with the Roman Empire, and a people that slaughtered many Galilean Jews in the recent wars. In fact, so hated were they that Josephus, the Jewish historian, writes that the Tyrians are our most bitter enemies. The woman then doesn't represent the oppression that we initially thought. She actually represents military power. What we don't comprehend is that she's part of the economic elite. That being in line with the Roman Empire, she has political power, she has financial power, she has money, status within the empire. She's not powerless, quite the opposite. She's the potent oppressor. And in a quite ironic twist from Jesus' words of bread, the very grain that the Galilean Jews would have gathered from their fields might well have ended up as the bread on her table. And yet she's asking for more than all of this. She's asking for the bread of life, for power and the healing that Jesus brings. Imagine Jesus' response then in this setting. He says to her, albeit not in these words, "You already lord it over us. You killed our people. You eat the labour of our hands. And yet you want the one thing that we, the Jewish people, have to call our own, the healing that comes from our Messiah." If Jesus had merely gone with her request and healed her daughter immediately, it would have been to condone the social inequality that he saw. It would have only been to tip the balance further, to say nothing about the injustice. Instead, he has to highlight this first. He has to let it be known that this is a situation that he cannot abhor. What's really interesting then is that she accepts her dressing down. She doesn't say, "Who are you to call me a dog?" She says, "Yes, Lord." And it's with faith that she continues to plead her case. She says, I am one of the bad guys. You know, I'm not the bright, almighty goody. I'm somewhere on that scale. But I realise that I can still benefit from the spiritual food that you have to offer. For us then, she's, I think, our archetype. She's the first woman who walked in the same footsteps that we tread now as Gentiles coming to Christ and seeking his healing. She's a monument, she's a symbol for our inclusion into the salvation which Christ brings. She stands as a figure throughout all of history, intercessing for us. But maybe more importantly, she stands as a reminder that we shouldn't place ourselves on that marking divide as the good guys against those bad Pharisees. That we ought not to think in monochrome. That we're the good guys, that we're deserving. But rather that we must think that we, just like the syrophoenician woman, are undeserving and benefit only because of the grace of God.